We ended the last chapter with some ominous words from Mom. Those words that kind of curse people when they say them in movies, like, at least things can't get any worse, or how could things get any worse? You always find out they can always get worse. So if you're using that as a clue, as foreshadowing, this chapter could be full of some worse. Chapter 4. Luke found out what Mother meant a few days later when he came down for breakfast. As usual, he opened the door from the back stairs to the kitchen only a crack. He could remember barely a handful of times in his entire life when someone had dropped by before breakfast, and each time Mother had managed to send Matthew or Mark up to warn Luke to stay out of sight. But he always checked. Today he could see Dad and Matthew and Mark at the table, and knew from the sound of frying bacon Mother must be at the stove. "Are the shades closed?" he called softly. Mother opened the door to the stairs. Luke started to step into the kitchen, but she put out her arm to keep him back. She handed him a plate full of scrambled eggs and bacon. Luke, honey, can you eat sitting on the bottom step there?" "What?" Luke asked. Mother looked beseechingly over her shoulder. "Dad thinks, I mean, it's not safe anymore to have you in the kitchen. You can still eat with us and talk to us and all, but you'll be over here." She waved her hand toward the stairs behind Luke. "But with the shades pulled," Luke started. "One of those workers yesterday asked me, 'Hey, farmer, you got air conditioning in that house of yours?'" Dad said from the table. He didn't turn around. He didn't seem to want to look at Luke. "We keep the shades pulled. Hot day like today, people get suspicious. This way is safer. I'm sorry." And then Dad did turn around and glance at Luke once. Luke tried to keep from looking upset. "So what do you tell him?" Matthew asked, as if the worker's question was only a matter of curiosity. "Told him, of course we don't have air conditioning. Farming don't make nobody a millionaire." Dad took a long sip of coffee. "Okay, Luke?" Mother asked. "Yes," he mumbled. He took the plate of eggs and bacon, but it didn't look good to him now. He knew every bite he ate would stick in his throat. He sat down on the step out of sight of both kitchen windows. So, real quick to recap, normally he sat in the kitchen with everybody else, moved around downstairs as long as no one was there, and the shades were closed. And they were usually closed, but now they're starting to leave them open because apparently a worker who had been building the houses nearby just casually asked Dad, "You got air conditioning?" Which leads us to believe, we can make an inference that air conditioning is not common. And if we think about all the resources that are not available in this time, air conditioning could kind of fit up there, energy costs and stuff. And Dad's like, "Of course we don't have air conditioning. We're an old farmhouse and we're poor." But that means now that people are noticing the windows are always closed, the shades are always closed, then they might get suspicious about why, since it's pretty obvious a house like that would not have air conditioning. I mean, it's kind of weird. I don't think I've ever really noticed anybody's house, like, windows, are they covered or not? Like, mind your own business, worker. But maybe if no one ever has air conditioning, so you're used to windows always being open, it kind of stands out with them closed, and the family can't take any chances. The only other two things to discuss is two more examples of how the book treats you like a big kid and wants you to figure out what someone is thinking or feeling without telling you exactly what they are thinking or feeling. For instance, when it says that Dad doesn't want to turn around. He didn't seem to want to look at Luke. There could be a lot of reasons why he wouldn't want to do that, why he wouldn't want to look at Luke. But if you look at the context, you can make a pretty good, solid inference about what he is feeling. Sometimes you don't want to look at someone because you're mad at them, because they're ugly, because his neck is stiff. But we know with context, Dad's probably covered with guilt. And he doesn't want to face Luke as he breaks his heart. He makes Mom do the talking, but then when Mom blames it only on Dad, she has to stop and say, "Oh, well, I mean, it's not safe. I can't put all this on Dad, make him the bad guy." The other time is when the food sticks in Luke's throat. No, it's not sticky food. No, it's not gross. He's upset. When you get upset and you're about to cry or you get angry, your throat gets tight. You get a lump in your throat. So it was hard for him to swallow his food. So that was a long way to say it, but important to notice those feelings. We'll leave the door open, Mother said. She hovered over him as if unwilling to return to the stove. This isn't too much different, is it? Mother, Dad said warningly. Through the open windows, Luke could hear the rumble of several trucks and cars. The workers had arrived for the day. He knew from watching through the vent the past few days that the caravan of vehicles came up the road like a parade. The cars would peel off to the side and unload the nicer-dressed men. The more rugged vehicles pulled on to the muddiest sections. People inside would scatter to the bulldozers and backhoes that had been left outside overnight. But the vehicles barely had time to get cold because the workers were there now from sun up to sun down. Someone was in a hurry for them to finish. Luke, I'm sorry, Mother said, and scurried back to the stove. She loaded a plate for herself, then sat down at the table beside Luke's usual spot. His chair wasn't even in the kitchen anymore. For a while, Luke watched Dad, Mother, Matthew, and Mark eating in silence, a complete family of 4. Once he cleared his throat, ready to protest again. You can't do this. It's not fair. Then he choked back the words unspoken. They were only trying to protect him. What could he do? Resolutely, Luke stuck his fork in the pile of scrambled eggs on his plate and took a bite. He ate the whole plateful of food without tasting any of it. So he's still pretty patient, doesn't really even argue when this change is made for him. It's pretty isolating, and still no whining from Luke. Chapter 5. Let's see if there's more bad news or if things will start to look up yet. Luke ate every meal after that on the bottom step. It became a habit, but a hated one. He had never noticed before, but Mother often spoke too softly to be heard from any distance, and Matthew and Mark always made their nasty comments under their breath, so they would start laughing, often at Luke's expense, and he couldn't defend himself because he didn't know what they had said. He couldn't even hear Mother saying, "Now be nice, boys." After a week or two, a lot of the time he didn't even try to listen to the rest of the family's conversation. But even he was curious the hot July day when the letter arrived about the pigs. Matthew brought the mail in that day from the mailbox at the crossroads a mile away. Luke had never seen them, of course, but Matthew and Mark had told him there were 3 mailboxes there, one for each of the families that lived on their road. Usually the Garner's mail was just bills or thin envelopes carrying curt orders from the government about how much corn to plant, which fertilizer to use, and where to take their crop when it was harvested. A letter from a relative was cause to celebrate. Mother always dropped whatever she was doing and sat down to open it with trembling hands, calling out at intervals, "Oh, Aunt Effie's in the hospital again." Or, "Elizabeth's going to marry that fellow after all." Luke almost felt he knew his relatives, though they lived hundreds of miles away. And of course, they didn't even know he existed. The letters Mother wrote back painstakingly late at night, when she'd saved up enough money for a stamp, contained plenty of news of Matthew and Mark, but never once had mentioned Luke's name. This letter was as thick as some from Luke's grandmother, but it bore an official seal, and the return address was an embossed Department of Human Habitation Environmental Standards Division. Matthew held the letter at arm's length, the way Luke had seen him hold dead baby pigs when they had to be carried out of the barn. Dad looked worried the minute he saw the letter in Matthew's hand. Matthew put the letter down beside Dad's silverware. He sighed. "Can't be anything but bad news. No use ruining a good meal. It can wait." He went back to eating chicken and dumplings. Only after his last belch did he turn the envelope over and run a dirt-rimmed fingernail under the flap. He unfolded the letter. "It has come to our attention. Well, so far I understand it." Then he read silently for a while, calling out at intervals, "Mother, what's offal?" And "Where's the dictionary? Matthew, look up reciprocity." Finally, he threw down the whole thick packet and proclaimed, "They're going to make us get rid of our hogs." What? Matthew asked. More serious than Mark, he had talked for as long as anyone could remember about, when I get my own farm, it's going to be all hogs. I'll make the government let me do that, somehow. Now he looked over Dad's shoulder. You mean they're just going to make us sell a lot at one time, right? But we can build the herd back up. Nope, Dad said. Those people in them fancy new houses won't be able to stand pig smell, so we can't raise hogs no more. He threw the letter out into the center of the table for all to see. What'd they expect? Building next to a farm. From his seat on the stairs, Luke had to hold himself back from going to fish the edge of the letter out of the chicken gravy and looking at it himself. They can't do that, can they? He asked. Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. Luke felt like a fool for asking as soon as the words were out of his mouth. For once, he was glad of his hiding place. Mother twisted a dish rag in her hand. Those hogs, they're our bread and butter. With grain prices the way they are, what are we going to live on? Dad just looked at her. After a moment, so did Matthew and Mark. Luke didn't know why. More bad news. This time the government sends a letter saying, no more hogs for you, family. That's add it to the list. Something the government is controlling. The beginning of the chapter also mentioned how sometimes they sent letters saying which fertilizer to use, where to take their crops, what to plant. That's not normal either. That's not usually how involved the government gets with every little detail of your life or your jobs. And so now they're saying you can't have pigs because of the smell that the people living nearby, the barons in their new homes, will have to deal with, and they don't want to. So the big deal about that for the family is grain prices have been terrible. So selling their harvest hasn't been enough to live on. When Mom uses the expression, the hogs are our bread and butter, it means they're literally, they put food on our table. Either we're eating them or we're eating something they paid for. The hogs are how they make money. And without those, they just stared at each other. They don't know what they're going to do. It doesn't seem to matter to anybody else. Okay, that was bad news for chapter 5. We'll see if they get a break in chapter 6. Chapter 6. The tax bill arrived 2 weeks later, the day that Dad, Matthew, and Mark loaded the hogs onto the livestock trailer and took them all away. Most were going to the slaughterhouse. The ones too young and too small to bring a decent price were going to an auction for feeder pigs. Luke watched through the vent at the front of the house as Dad drove by in the battered pickup with each load. Matthew and Mark sat in the back of the pickup, making sure the trailer stayed hitched right. Even 3 stories up, Luke could see Matthew's hangdog expression. That means he's sad. Then when the 3 of them came into the house for dinner, after washing the last of the hog smell off their hands in the mudroom, Dad handed Mother the tax bill without comment. She put down the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir the stew and unfolded the letter. Then she dropped it. Why, that's... She seemed to be doing the math in her head as she bent to retrieve it. That's 3 times what it usually is. There must be a mistake. Dad shook his head grimly. No mistake. I talked to Williker at the auction. The Willikers were their nearest neighbors with a house 3 miles down the road. Luke always pictured them with monster scales and fierce claws because of the number of times he'd been cautioned, you don't want the Willikers to see you. Dad went on. Williker says they raised everyone's taxes because of them fancy houses. Makes our land worth more. Isn't that good? Luke asked eagerly. It was strange. He should hate the new houses for replacing his woods and forcing him to stay indoors. But he'd half fallen in love with them, having watched every foundation poured, every skeleton of walls and roofs raised to the sky. They were his main entertainment, aside from talking to Mother when she came upstairs for what she called my Luke breaks. Sometimes she pretended his room needed cleaning as badly as the bread needed baking or the garden needed weeding. Sometimes she just sat and talked. Dad was shaking his head in disgust over Luke's question. No, it's only good if we're selling, and we ain't. All it means for us is that the government thinks they can get more money out of us. Matthew was slumped in his chair at the table. How are we going to pay? That's more than we got for all the hogs, and that was supposed to carry us through for a long time. Dad didn't answer. Even Mark, who normally had a smart alecky comeback for everything, was stupefied. Mother had turned back to her stew. I got my work permit today, she said softly. The factory's hiring. If I can get on there, I can maybe get an advance on my paycheck. Luke's jaw dropped. You can't go to work. Who will... He wanted to say, who will stay with me? Who will I talk to all day when everyone else is outside? But that seemed too selfish. Luke looked around. No one else looked surprised by Mother's news. He shut his mouth. So the person that's there with him all day that keeps him company is gone. Now he'll have no one to talk to and nowhere to go and nothing to do. But they have to make money somehow because now these higher taxes are going to cost them more and they'll have even less. And maybe Mom getting a job is what the rest of them had been looking at each other, thinking about when Luke wasn't sure why they were just staring at each other. But that's a pretty big change for everyone.